Look, if a Soviet-Cuban master plan had actually existed, we would have won the Cold War. If there had been a master plan. But unfortunately, there was no such plan. Quite the opposite. Cuba's actions conflicted with Soviet interests at that time.
But to whom in the Kremlin could Reagan talk peace? In March 1984, Yuri Andropov died. His successor, Konstantin Chernenko, was too frail to start a dialogue. The West looked for some small sign of change.
We needed to try to search out the people who would guide the Soviet Union after Brezhnev, after Andropov. And looking around, there were about 2 or 3 possible people in terms of age and seniority. We dispatched invitations to all 3. It was pure chance that Gorbachev was the one who accepted first. When Gorbachev came to the United Kingdom, he indeed brought his wife, and that was one of the first signs that we were dealing with someone quite different. Soviet leaders very, very rarely traveled with their wives anywhere.
I'm cautiously optimistic. I like Mr. Gorbachev. We can do business together. We better hang on from them.
March 1985. Konstantin Chernenko was dead. At his funeral, world leaders paid their respects to Mikhail Gorbachev and weighed up the new, younger man in charge of the Soviet Union.
George Bush was there. As vice president, he was head of our delegation. When we walked out of that meeting, I said to George, I said, this is a very different Soviet leader than any we've seen before.
Солдаты дружественных армий. Их часто можно видеть рядом, и в минуты отдыха, и в бою, и в день добровольного труда, хашара, как его здесь называют. Мы побывали на одном из таких дней, когда воины участвовали в строительстве новых корпусов детского дома Ватан, Родина. Ибо советский воин не только защитник, но и созидатель. Немало народно-хозяйственных объектов Демократической Республики Афганистан.
Hoping the US and Pakistan would accept a coalition friendly to Moscow, Gorbachev chose a new Afghan leader, Mohammad Najibullah. Gorbachev instructed Najibullah to offer talks with the Mujahideen about forming an Afghan government of national reconciliation. On return from his first summit with Gorbachev, Reagan sensed Moscow wanted a deal to get out of Afghanistan. But American hardliners wanted revenge for Vietnam. Pressed by Congress, Reagan urged the Mujahideen to go for victory.
It wasn't until really between about 83 to 85 that the forces in Washington who asked the question, well, maybe we can win this. Let's not put in $100 million a year worth of weapons. Let's put in $1 billion a year worth of weapons.
In 1988, under the terms of the Geneva Agreement, Soviet troops started pulling out. But instead of peace, Afghanistan was to endure more years of bloodshed. Fighting among rival groups of Islamic fundamentalists continued to destroy the country long after the Cold War was over. The talks didn't restart till the next day.
President Bush said something about America's allies wanting the United States to stay in Europe. And Gorbachev said, we want the United States to stay in Europe too. The United States is a European power. And given the history, where we had always believed, and where all of us who had been taught about the Cold War, believed that it was the principal goal of Soviet power to get America out of Europe. This was an extraordinary statement, and it stuck with everybody.
Boris Yeltsin had been Communist Party chief in Moscow. Popular, ambitious, he now used economic discontent to weaken Gorbachev and the Soviet Union. In May 1990, he was chosen parliamentary leader of the Russian Republic. On the international scene, Gorbachev was still the man the West could do business with. At their meetings, Gorbachev asked Bush for help in his economic difficulties. Bush warned Gorbachev not to use violence if the Baltic states pushed for independence.
It looked like the Soviet Union was coming unstuck a little bit. At that point, I think we started to believe we were in a race to try to finish the business of ending the Cold War with Gorbachev still in power.
The Red Army was pulling out of an Eastern Europe it had dominated for decades. In Germany, the troops would leave a question mark behind them. Divided by the Cold War, Germany was moving towards unification. Would the Soviet Union really allow a united Germany to belong to the West's military alliance, NATO?
Personally, for Gorbachev and for me, it wasn't a problem. But it was a problem for Soviet society, which had gone through the terrible war with fascist Germany and suffered the death of 20 or 30 million people.
The West German Chancellor Helmut Kohl undertook to limit Germany's military strength, to pay the Red Army's resettlement costs, not to station nuclear weapons in East Germany. Kohl was ecstatic. Gorbachev had accepted that a united Germany could belong to NATO. August 2nd, 1990, Iraq invades Kuwait. Iraq was a Soviet ally. In spite of Iraqi-Soviet ties, Secretary of State Baker succeeded in persuading Shevardnadze to a joint condemnation of the invasion.
The minister has indicated that there was some difficulty on the part of the Soviet Union in coming to this agreement.
Shevardnadze had consulted Gorbachev, but he knew their hardline enemies would use it against them. In Moscow, the daily lines for food grew longer. Tempers rose.
Can you imagine we'd live to see the day when we needed coupons to buy socks? There weren't even any socks available. There was nothing on the shelves except out-of-date tins of fish. That was the result of perestroika.
People began to question Gorbachev's reforms. They started to listen to demagogues who promised that everything would be better tomorrow.
Yeltsin's struggle with Gorbachev was out in the open. Russia, richest of the republics, would be Yeltsin's road to power.
Russia, where Yeltsin and his radical Democrats were taking over, had practically declared independence from the Soviet Union. They adopted law after law that replaced the laws of the Soviet Union.
In summer, Gorbachev went to London. As usual, he basked in the welcome he received overseas. He had business to do. At the United States Embassy, he met Bush and agreed the terms of another New Deal on arms limitation. But for the Soviet economy, the urgent need was for financial aid. Gorbachev asked the leading capitalist countries for massive loans. In seeking to end the Cold War, he was doing them all a favor. But in spite of the smiles and the handshakes, they turned him down flat. Yeltsin sent a plane to bring Gorbachev back to Moscow. He arrived early on August the 22nd.
Все, что мы сделали после 1985 года, уже дало свои реальные плоды. Общество, люди наши стали другими.
The next day in the Russian parliament, Yeltsin rammed home his victory.
Вот Борис Николаевич мне сейчас, когда уже мы встретились, он дал краткое изложение заседания Кабинета министров, но я его еще не читал.
Humiliated by Yeltsin, and at last realizing that the Communist Party of the Soviet Union's role was finished, Gorbachev resigned as General Secretary. As talks on the Union continued, Gorbachev, still president of the USSR, was isolated.
Главное, на что ушло, наверное, половина времени, каким быть союзом.
At Minsk, on December the 8th, Russia, Belarus and Ukraine, the three Slav states, acted to dissolve the Soviet Union and set up instead a commonwealth of independent states. The Soviet Union was finished, and so was Mikhail Gorbachev. They told George Bush before telling Gorbachev what they'd done.
It's disgraceful. To tell the President of the United States and not bother to inform the President of your own country. It's shameful. Absolutely contemptible. It's dirty.
Мораль.